Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When it comes to purchasing a Starship, safety is of paramount importance. And that's because accidents and malfunctions on starships in space usually leads to instantaneous death. That is, unless you have plot armor surrounding you. And so for those of you guys in the market for a cheap ship, we've listed several vessels here that you definitely want to avoid because they are extremely unreliable. Now, before we begin, I think I owe you guys some explanation over what's been happening on this channel for the last few weeks. Why is apathetic and cynical Alan, the Star Wars YouTuber, suddenly talking about the war in Ukraine for so long? Well, it's because I am no stranger to tyranny. You see, my parents grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution, which they survived. They immigrated here in the 80s and they had me. I was born days before the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement started.
Now in China, lack of democracy, lack of freedom, especially freedom of press.
And ended with a massacre. That's where the first tank man was born, and now his form is being perfected by our Ukrainian brothers. When the current conflict in Ukraine started in 2014 in Crimea and Donbass, I was in Hong Kong holding a camera as I watched the student-led democracy movement get crushed by the Chinese Communist Party. Years later, I watched as the Chinese Coast Guard stole the traditional fishing grounds of Filipino fishermen right off the coast of their own country. So yeah, I've always cared and I've always been involved, just not in front of the camera, usually behind it. And right now, my only platform that I could use is the 600,000 subscribers I have on this channel, and it's very important to me what's happening right now, because my allegiance has always been, metaphorically, to the Republic, to democracy. And yeah, I'm sorry I'm showing bombed out cities and warfare on what is supposed to be a Star Wars channel. I know it's disturbed a lot of people, annoyed others, but this is the reality of what the world is going through right now. And you know, I see a lot of people claim that they're fighting for freedom for this cause or that cause, but this is what actually fighting for freedom looks like. And yes, this is going to hurt my channel, because YouTube does not like seeing warfare, but algorithm ilinahui. But if Ukraine falls, what do you think will happen next? Do you really think that there won't be an escalation? That Putin, who already has plans for invading other EU countries, will just stop in Ukraine? He didn't stop after Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, and then Donbass. And do you really think that NATO and the United States won't step in and start a confrontation with the Russian Federation that will lead to more destruction than we've ever seen in human history? You, the cynical and apathetic individual, you know who I'm talking about. I see you guys in the YouTube comment section all the time. You don't shed any tears right now, but I guarantee you when your cities are being burnt to the ground and your women and children are lying in pools of blood, you will shed tears. Think about moments like this when things could have been stopped, escalations could have been prevented. We can stop the madness of Putin now. Not as representatives of our nations, but as individual citizens who can connect to each other online, who can logistically supply the Ukrainians with whatever they need, whether it's support, defensive equipment, health supplies. And if you guys want to help, I've listed down in the description several links that you can take a look at. Also, there is a battle of information being fought online. Russia continues to close down its access to the wider world. But if you have any way to reach Russian-speaking people, tell them that our war is not with them, our anger is not towards them, but towards Putin. Because really the only guaranteed way this all stops is if Putin is removed from power. Test pilots are amongst the most crazy individuals in any military organization. And that's because instead of flying tried and tested platforms, they must be the first ones to try out crazy prototype ships that have only been flown in theory and in simulations. Here in the United States, for instance, most of our early astronauts in NASA's Apollo program were test pilots, and they definitely had the right stuff to accomplish the mission. During the Galactic Civil War, the Alliance to restore the Republic had some problems taking down larger Imperial capital ships. Their main fighter bomber, the Y-Wing, was a well-rounded assault craft, but lacked the firepower the rebels were looking for. And so, when the opportunity came for Phoenix Cell to examine a new prototype assault ship designed by the Mon Calamari engineer known as Corey, well, they took it. Now, Corey was a very eccentric individual. He clearly knew his ships very well, and his B6 prototype was definitely unique, but it was also built in his personal garage. And so it's not surprising that when Harrison Dulles stepped in to test the vessel, it immediately lost power and plummeted towards the ground. Luckily, this Twilight pilot is probably one of the top 100 pilots in the entire galaxy and manages to restart the engine before the B-6 prototype hits the canyon floor. If you think about it, if it had hit the floor, there probably wouldn't be any B-wings in the future, which is what this was a prototype of. The B-6 prototype would enter mass production as the B-wing in the last few years of the war. And while this B-wing was substantially more reliable than the B-6 prototype, it still had some really strange design choices. For instance, the entire ship's body was capable of rotating around the cockpit, which did enhance its mobility. But this kind of reminds me of something my dad told me when I was a child, wistfully looking at the lightly cocaine-powdered pop-up lights of an 8 Series BMW. He said to me, "Anything that moves mechanically can break mechanically, so don't buy it." Yes, the Millennium Falcon belongs on the most unreliable ship list. That doesn't mean, however, that this isn't one of the most awesome starships ever built. These two things can exist in the same vessel. The Millennium Falcon was originally a YT-1300F Stellar Envoy Light Freighter. So it was designed to haul goods and serve as a tugboat for larger containers, which is why the cockpit of this ship is offset, and there's also a fork-like recess in the front of the ship which can be latched onto containers or an escape pod. Ukrainian Engineering Corporation was known for creating very affordable and very modular ships that were very good for commerce or smuggling. They were famous for having a huge third-party aftermarket selection of parts that one could bolt onto their ships. This is usually where a lot of problems started occurring. Aftermarket parts can sometimes improve the performance of a ship, but there are oftentimes reliability issues with these additional parts. For the Millennium Falcon, for instance, the largest problem was the hyperdrive system. Han Solo had installed the Class 0.5 hyperdrive onto the freighter, one of the fastest in the entire galaxy, when it worked. But when the hyperdrive motivator started acting up on the Millennium Falcon, it went immediately from a Class 0.5 hyperdrive to a Class 10, which makes it one of the slowest ships in the entire galaxy. One of the greatest disasters during the High Republic era was an event known as the Great Hyperspace Disaster. A group of marauders in the Outer Rim known as Nile had developed a unique type of hyperdrive known as the Path Engine. Connected to a Force user, this engine could create new lanes outside of traditional hyperspace lanes. This gave the Nile an unprecedented amount of maneuverability in hyperspace and made their hit-and-run attacks on civilian ships extremely hard to track down. What sets off the Great Hyperspace Disaster was one of these Nile ships accidentally or purposely, What sets off the Great Hyperspace Disaster is when one of these Nile ships cuts off a civilian ship that is already in hyperspace. The ship was known as the Legacy Run. It was a modular freight transport, which honestly looks a lot like a Dune Spacing Guild liner. The Legacy Run, like most massive freighters, was just one gigantic box with an engine attached to it. The ship was twice as old as its captain, Hedda Cassette, a former veteran of the Malastare-Sulis Joint Task Force, a regional defense force. She had been a fighter pilot back in the day, and she took great care of the Legacy Run and made sure that all of its major systems were well maintained. Captain Hedda Cassette tried to steer the Legacy Run out of the way of the incoming Nile ship in hyperspace, but any abrupt movement at hyperspace speeds can be very dangerous. So it wasn't a surprise when the ship's superstructure began failing from that maneuver. The Legacy Run was just too old. Before the bridge vented into hyperspace, Captain Cassette and her crew bravely sealed off as many passenger compartments on the freighter as possible and probably saved a lot of lives. Unfortunately, these passenger compartments were still flying randomly through space at FTL speeds. The High Republic and Jedi Order would launch a massive effort to slow down these individual projectiles and prevent them from running into space stations and even populated moons and worlds. The Fireball is basically an ugly. That's a Star Wars term for a bolted together ship with parts from at least 2 individual starships. In the Fireball's case, this was a fighter that had parts from an old X-Wing starfighter combined with an even older Z-75 Headhunter. The starship was owned by former Rebel X-Wing pilot Jarek Yeager, a veteran of the Battle of Jakku. The Fireball was primarily built and modified for racing. It was stationed on the Colossus supertanker and refueling station located on the oceanic world of Castilian. Racing these fighters was a major income source for the people living on this platform. The Fireball would be flown by Cassiono, former New Republic fighter pilot. He would have constant problems with failing parts and mechanical issues on his starfighter. It was said that the Fireball was named the Fireball because its engines would occasionally flame out during very important mid-air maneuvers. The Dusty Duck was a custom-made freighter that was designed by the Palawic smuggler known as Namashdim. It was considered quite an unreliable ship and would often lose power in the middle of deep space or lose stability upon entering the atmosphere of a planet. During the Naboo crisis, the ship was parked right outside of Mos Espa. Unfortunately, at the same time, Darth Maul had landed on the planet looking for the fugitive Queen Padme Amidala. Maul followed Qui-Gon Jinn and assumed that he entered the Dusty Duck. The Zabrak assassin would board the Dusty Duck and slaughter everyone on board, and so the Dusty Duck would just kind of sit there outside of Mos Espa for the rest of the time. And no one would loot it, no one would scavenge it, no one would steal it, which kind of points towards how terrible the ship is in the first place. Anyway, there you have it, guys. Those are 5 different unreliable ships. I would definitely recommend you avoid these things unless you want to be vented into hyperspace while you're flying around the galaxy. Also, please check out the description down below if you guys want to help Ukraine. If you don't have money, there are many other ways that you can help. There's entire information war being fought online. There are still Russian citizens out there who are connected to the rest of the world. It's our duty to connect with them and explain to them what their regime is doing to their Slavic brothers. Because, 50% of Ukrainians actually have family in Russia, which is just a huge tragedy.